Coyle is part of the faculty at Clemson. He joined them in 2018. And his focus is forest health and invasive species. And prior to Clemson, he created and directed the Southern Forest Health and Invasive Species Program, which provided education and training to forestry professionals across the southeastern United States. David uses various forms of communication, including social media, traditional writing, and in-person visits to help educate people about forest health, invasive species, and forest management. He's a member of the Society of American Foresters and the Entomological Society of America. He has served on the board of directors for the North American Invasive Species Management Association and ProForest, and he is a permanent member of the South Carolina Invasive Species Advisory Committee. And we are very lucky to have him joining us this evening to talk. And we were also just talking with him about the possibility of him doing a in-person program as well upcoming. So we will keep you posted on all of that. Before I turn it over to Dave, I'm just going to say that he welcomes questions. If you all want to like raise your hand or pop yourself in, or if you want to put something in the chat, I'm happy to read it. I think that's pretty much it. So without further ado, Dave, take it away, and thank you so much.
Thanks, Nikki. We can see how tonight goes before we lock in a live thing. All right, see how the reviews are.
Okay.
Well, hello everybody. Good evening. Hope everyone's doing all right. My name, like we said, Dave Coyle. I'm based at Clemson in the mothership up there in the upstate, but I'm kind of statewide and region-wide, quite honestly. And I've done invasive species and forest health work for more years than I care to count. So it's near and dear to my heart. And we were talking earlier with Colin and Nikki that I'm actually in Charleston a lot because I lead the Asian longhorn beetle program, which is very much right there in the Ravenel-Cauca area. So tonight we'll talk about not just ALB, but invasives in South Carolina. What are you and why are you here is what I like to call it. So we'll give a little bit of background on what we have, how we got them, and in some cases, can we do anything about them whatsoever? Before we get started, like I've done this for a long time and I've got opinions. And so I will share some opinions on some of these things. I will tell you when they are an opinion, and I will tell you when it is fact-based. But after you've seen things for a while, you know how the brain works, right? So let's start with the biggest question. What is an invasive species? Because terms can be super confusing, and I will admit science is not good when it comes to terms because there's usually too many of them, right? So what's an invasive species? So if it's a native species, it means from here. And I hope you're saying, well, Dave, what does here mean? I think from an ecological fauna and flora perspective, you're looking on a continental scale, right? So if something is from North America, I just tend to think of it as native. Insects, plants, fungi, vertebrates don't see these socioeconomic borders. They don't know where Minnesota ends and Canada starts. They have no clue where South Carolina ends and Georgia starts. So it's just kind of look at a continental scale. So if something is from North America, for all intents and purposes, it's native. If it's not from North America, it could be called all sorts of stuff: non-native, exotic, alien. All of these mean the same thing. It just simply means it's a species not from here. So in our case, not from North America. When we talk about invasive species, this is a thin little slice of that whole non-native pie, right? So you've got all these non-native things, and you've got a little sliver. Those are your invasives. Think of these as the worst of the worst, okay? So to be invasive, they have to have like four main characteristics. They have to not be from here. They have to cause some sort of measurable damage. That can be economic, that can be environmental, that can be agricultural, that can be human health. There's a disease spreading type thing, right? They have to displace native populations, meaning push out the native stuff that was there, and there has to be a sustaining population of that thing. Think about Asian longhorn beetle. If only one of them had ever gotten to North America and it was a male, we're not having any of these conversations because that's going nowhere, right? So it's got to have a population to actually do something. So what makes an invasive species an invasive species? And I was thinking of this quote from Michael Scott: "Why are you the way that you are?" which he said to Toby. So invasives have a number of pretty common characteristics. The first one is they have the ability oftentimes to attack a healthy host plant. For a lot of these tree pests we'll talk about and some of these other ones, it doesn't matter how healthy your tree is. If an invasive species finds it and wants to get in there, it's going to be able to chew its way in and do that. They're able to move and rapidly disperse. That allows them to cover all sorts of ground, all sorts of territory. With this, typically comes a very high reproductive rate, whether that's a lot of eggs or larvae or babies at one time, or the ability to lay multiple clutches of eggs or have multiple broods in a year. That's a high reproductive rate. And in general, they can survive a wide range of conditions, right? It's not like they're basically not fragile. Okay? And this is what part of what really makes an invasive species invasive is just its ability to survive anywhere and everything. So how do we get these things? The short answer is we buy stuff. Okay? We are a global economy, a purchasing, economy. We buy stuff, and this is the Cliff Notes version of why we have invasives, right? And so there's lots and lots of data out there that shows you as more stuff comes into a country, more imports, right? So you got more imports coming in, there's more pests that get found. Okay, and this is just we're going to talk a little bit here about the numbers game of the whole globalization, right? This is a somewhat crude figure showing imports and exports to the US and from the US in 2025. $4.3 trillion in goods. And there's so many zeros on there, it's tough to conceive how much that is. But on this figure, the bigger the arrow, the more stuff is moving. If it's green, it's going out. Sorry, if it's green, it's going out. If it's red, it's coming in. So our two biggest green arrows are going to Canada and Mexico. That's where we're sending the most imports in terms of where does the US send stuff, Canada and Mexico, right? Fairly obvious. The biggest red arrow coming in, I'm sure y'all can take a guess, coming from China, right? We buy all sorts of stuff from China, and there's all sorts of reasons for that. And quite frankly, most of those reasons all dwindle down to economic, right? Stuff is cheap and we can get it cheap, and that's why it's there. The technology is there, not here, all these things. So we buy stuff and stuff gets shipped. Okay, this is the little breakdown of how this happens. Stuff gets shipped, stuff gets inspected, and sometimes we find the pests in there. And I will admit that the folks we have doing these inspections are very good at it. They go through tons of training. We're talking APHIS, Animal Plant Health Inspection Service, Customs and Border Protection, USDA, like they all work together. They do really good. We find lots and lots and lots of stuff. Okay, tens of thousands of things are found every year. So it's not like we're not doing anything about it. We're doing all we can, right? And this is from humans looking at solid wood packing material. You've got your ag inspectors. Dogs are incredibly helpful for a lot of things just because of their nose. And you can train these dogs. And we might talk about dogs a little more. But there's lots of examples out here to show that we have found these pests. Now, does it make the main news? Probably not. But people in my line of work, we kind of know where to look, and there's lots of these press releases all the time of like first time finds of this thing and first time finds of this thing, and it comes in all forms of stuff. So they do a really good job finding the things that are coming in. That said, sometimes we don't find them, right? And I mentioned earlier solid wood packing material. I mentioned this because I work with woody things and trees, and a lot of the pests I work with live in wood. Wood that comes in as solid wood packing material is things like pallets, those great big spools that we have wires wrapped around, bracing bolts and bracing, logs that you see there, and then dunnage, which is really, really common and kind of a wild little thing. What is dunnage? Dunnage is simply rough cut wood that's shoved into a barge to either balance it or brace something. It can be, big chunks like this. It could be just a bunch of random sized blocks of wood. For whatever reason, a lot of that I know the reason. The reason, a lot of these other things like the spools and the pallets, they have to go through a treatment process to where everything inside them should be killed. For some reason, dunnage does not have to go through that. So theoretically, you could just cut a tree down and shove that tree in the barge, and then it could go from China to America without really any oversight. So it's just one of those things. So I tell you about this solid wood packing material because as it gets from point A to point B, it's incredibly, incredibly complex, right? So this is the life of the pallet that I'm showing you on this slide. starting with number one in the upper left when that pallet is still a tree. It goes through all these different steps until finally in the lower left or lower right hand corner, it gets destroyed. But in almost all of these stops along the way, there's a chance for pests, whether they're insects or mollusks or fungi, to get onto that pallet. So there's lots of times when stuff could get onto this wood packing material and make its way here. With that little tidbit of knowledge, let's just look at the volume of stuff that's coming in all the time, right? So this was in Savannah, which is the second largest port by volume on the eastern seaboard, I believe. I think it's number two now. This is just one ship. And remember, this port goes 24/7. I did my redneck math. There's about 3,500 containers on that ship. For reference, that's how big the people are. That's the people down there in that little corner, right? So each of those containers, remember, fits on the back of a semi. So think about how much volume is coming in on this one, what I'm told is a moderately sized barge, and they're going 24/7. So just the sheer volume of it all, it's not all getting inspected, right? There's just no feasible way that all that stuff is going to get inspected. So with that said, sometimes we don't find the pests at all, and sometimes those pests are going to get away. Not every pest that gets away is going to establish. Maybe it's just a male, maybe it's the wrong time of the year, maybe something eats it, who knows, right? But some of them do get established. We know this. And for the things that, especially those that come from Southeastern Asia, when they get to the Southeastern US, especially, man, it feels like home. Okay. And so this graph right here, this figure is color coded, and each color shows you kind of a forest type. So if you look in the Southeast, we've got that bright yellow. That means there's lots of pines, lots of oaks. It's humid, it's hot, not really much of a winter. Where else do you see that bright yellow color? But right over there in Southeast Asia, right? And as you work your way up the eastern seaboard, you've got the same light green, kind of starting in your North Carolina into the mid-Atlantic, over north, a little farther up there in Asia. This also explains why a lot of the stuff that hits Canada and the Northeast is from Europe. It's a lot colder climate. They're conditioned to the cold. And this is also explains why a lot of the Mediterranean things are more successful in the Pacific Southwest, just because it's so hot and so dry over there. So when things come from point A to point B to North America, they may emerge from their woody packing material or what have you, and they're finding a similar climate. They're finding similar vegetation. What they are not finding is the natural enemies that are in their native land that typically keeps those populations down, and populations of that pest then can just kind of explode. And then once things get here, we as people typically inadvertently move them around. Okay, so firewood is a major way that a lot of wood boring things move. This is not my vehicle, just so we're clear, but I did see this a lot of years ago at this point. But there's been good studies to show that there's lots of insects that can live in a piece of firewood for 2 to 3 years. If that firewood just sits there, they just sit in there and gnaw away at it. Pine straw is one of the main ways we see things move. Here's pine straw with an invasive Japanese climbing fern in it right there. And then we see here spongy moth on the bottom of a truck that was going from Indiana down to Florida. Just happened to stop because of a flat tire. And the person that stopped to help it was with the Indiana DNR and noticed these things. And of course, the person driving it had no idea it was on there. They were literally just going to see grandma for Thanksgiving and happened to find this and be able to stop it. So these things get established. We move them around. Some of the things that get established are bad. And if they're bad, that is when we have a situation, right? And so that's what we're going to talk about tonight. So once we have these situations, people like me come in and we try to figure out how do we manage things and how do we try to make it not as bad, right? So then following up on that, are all non-native insects and pathogens bad? Remember, the invasive ones are that little bitty sliver, right? So most of the non-native stuff that comes in North America doesn't really do anything. It'll either fizzle out on its own or the populations will stay so low that we can't even really measure their impact. Okay. Again, just a handful are causing damage. I'll give you just a quick example. This was some research I did up in the Savannah River site, which is just across the road from Augusta in Aiken County there. We trapped all sorts of wood boring beetles, the longhorn beetles with prestids, weevils, all this. Most of these things are native species, okay? But if you look at this one type, the ambrosia beetles, we'll talk about a couple of ambrosia beetles this evening. Uh, a quarter of the species were non-native, but almost 80% of the individuals were non-native, right? So that is a group of things that is just 100%, not 100%, but almost completely dominated by non-native species at this point. So all these together is kind of why we have the problem we have with these invasive species. Now let's talk about a few invasive species we have in South Carolina and throughout the Southeast. And then hopefully now after we talk about these things, you'll be able to see these when you're out and about doing your thing. First is the elm leaf beetle. So this is a super common beetle. It's, we can make the argument is it's invasive or just, sort of here. I think the damage is bad enough that it makes it invasive. All elms are possible as hosts. The adults can be a nuisance because they'll overwinter in houses, and they get active, late mid-May to late May. But one thing that these beetles do is the larvae skeletonize leaves. So they'll eat everything except the leaf veins. And so it sort of looks like you can, think of a skeleton, right? You can see through that thing. And once those leaves are skeletonized, what's left sort of browns up, and we call that leaf bronzing. And so this is what it looks like up close. But to me, this is the real telltale sign, because every year right now, if you're driving down the road from the coast to the upstate, you could practically pick out every elm tree on the landscape because they're brown right now, because the elm leaf beetles have just completely hammered all those things. So here, these are your elm trees right here. Most of these are going to be winged elm, but this is one that's super common, especially if you have a place where there's lots of elm trees. You're going to see these things. One of the invasives we don't have in the low country yet, and I say yet, we may get it, we may not, is emerald ash borer. But I feel compelled to talk about this because it's arguably the worst forest invasive of this generation, I would say. And so, the impact of it alone, millions of trees, billions of dollars in damage, it's almost impossible to truly calculate the damage this thing has done. It feeds on ash, so ash trees only. They've got a real, big compound leaf, these samaras in the bark. I always think the bark looks like an accordion that's folded up, is kind of how I think of the bark for ash trees. And I point the ash tree out because every now and again we get, I heard emerald ash borer will eat other things too, because there was some science that said, oh, they developed in a white fringe tree, or they were able to survive in an olive tree. And this sort of creates all sorts of, just a lot of kerfuffle about it. The fact of the matter is, where these things happen, I think there's got to be context. I think it's important to have context with some of these invasives. In the case of the olive tree, this study was done in a lab, and they put larvae in a branch in a container, and it didn't die right away. In the case of the fringe tree, this was found in areas where the EAB populations were absolutely sky high and all the ash was dead. So in both cases, when your option is to eat something that doesn't taste great or die, you're probably going to eat the thing that you don't really like, right? And I think this is what happened. I say this because I don't think there's any way that fringe trees in South Carolina are in danger whatsoever. I recommend planting them to everyone. You're only going to get emerald ash borer hopping out of these hosts in conditions that will never manifest themselves in the deep south, just because we don't have as much ash as they do in the Midwest, and the populations have sort of died down. So that said, plant a fringe tree. That's one of the most beautiful things we have out there. The life cycle of emerald ash borer. These adults will come out in late March, April, and then they feed on the leaves a little bit. This is the damage that doesn't hurt the tree. Trees can often handle 10 to 15 to 20% defoliation with zero physiological impacts, right? So they're able to handle losing some leaves. Eggs will hatch, and then this is the damaging life cycle. You've got these larvae, and they will just sort of mine their way underneath the bark, eating the phloem. And so that's the green part of the tree. If you peel that bark back, it's green typically, and this is where food is moving. So they're taking away the part of the tree that moves the food up and down. So then the trees essentially starve and die. They'll pupate in there in these little frass pack galleries. Frass is our fancy entomological term for poop. So that's all that is. And so we found EAB, in the late 90s, and it's all over the eastern North America at this point. I know Canada's not on this map, but it's in the provinces of Canada up there. We now have it across the Rocky Mountains out there in the Pacific Northwest. There's a spot in Vancouver as well. So, this one is just sort of working its way up and down, filling in the gaps over here in the east, working its way up and down the coast out west, unfortunately. Every ash tree is susceptible, which is even worse because there's ash are really commonly used in urban settings. They're a great urban tree, great shade canopy, support a lot of natural wildlife. What do you look for emerald ash borer? This is also tricky because the first thing you'll see is a declining or thinning crown, and this can be from any number of things, right? This is generally a tree's first response to some sort of stress. Drought stress, crown declines. Damage from construction, crown will decline. Damage from bugs, crown declines. The kicker, though, is after the crown declines, the tree will send up these epicormic sprouts right at the bottom there. A colleague of mine, Stephen Pullman, once called this the soul of the tree escaping because this is the tree's last gasp attempt at life. Spoiler alert, it never works. And the management for this is to cut that thing off at the ground and put something else in there. Once you see a tree that is only epicormic sprouts, it is on its way out, folks. If you look closely, you'll see cracked bark. And then if you look even more closely, you'll see these perfectly shaped or perfectly D-shaped exit holes, same shape every time. And that's what the adults come out. And again, those galleries are all over underneath there. And the gallery, the larvae will eat every single bit of foam underneath there. It's really quite wild. And then sometimes you'll see this ash blonding, and this is if you're doing a 60-mile-an-hour drive-by on the road, you might see an ash tree that looks like it's, kind of whitish, and that's from the woodpeckers stripping off that bark. The woodpeckers and squirrels are stripping off that bark, trying to get the larvae underneath there. And to that note, if you have an ash tree and all of a sudden it is loaded with woodpeckers, it's not because they're loving whatever suet ball you're putting out there. It's because they're trying to eat the larvae inside that tree. So woodpeckers have been found to be a really good indicator for stuff like this. You can't save an ash tree now. I know when this thing first happened, way back when, it was a death sentence for the ash tree, but we've got lots of technology and insecticides that work great at this point. The sad thing is the emerald ash borer typically starts high in the tree. So all of these trees have EAB, even though it doesn't look like it. And by the time you often see it, they're almost half dead. So it gets really hard to save them. Moving on to something a little more close to y'all, we got the Asian longhorn beetle. So this is native to Asia, very wide host range. That being said, it prefers maples here in South Carolina. It's about 98% of what it eats is a maple tree. Pretty good sized beetle in terms of, beetles. And it looks a lot like some other ones we have, some of our cottonwood borers and monocamus, that type of thing. The females are much larger. I call it much larger than the males. They've got what I would call a pretty typical longhorn beetle behavior and life cycle. The female will get on a tree and chew these little egg, we call them egg sites, egg niches. They're about the diameter of a dime or so. So she chews these little pits in there, whips around, shoves an egg into each one. And these will be up and down the tree. Okay. This is going to happen in late June to July. Okay. So this has already happened. At this point, the eggs will hatch. The larvae will first start feeding on that phloem. And because of that, almost always the maples will drip this really dark black sap. This is what we're seeing right now. It's still, August 26th. Most of the larvae right now are in the phloem of the tree, and you'll see this black sap. Another week or so, they're going to start changing, and they're going to go straight into the xylem, the heartwood of the tree, the middle of that tree, the middle of that branch, and they'll start eating the wood. And then you'll start seeing sawdust shavings and wood shavings getting pushed out all over the place. This is the real damaging part of the life cycle. You can see those larvae. Some of them can get almost as big as your pinky finger, and they just completely Swiss cheese the wood and the tree that they're eating and that they're feeding on. This, of course, causes lots of breakage. It just completely degrades the structure of the tree, and it just kind of falls apart, which obviously is a big issue with the windstorms and any hurricanes we might have down there. You have these big branches falling. This fell in one of our study areas. Here it is in my hand on the left. And then every one of these arrows is pointing to a larval gallery. So that's all the places these larvae chewed. Of course, when you have that much wood removed and you get a wind, all this stuff breaks and falls. After they develop all the way through probably about February, and then they'll pupate in the tree starting March, April, and then they will chew their way out in May with that perfectly round exit hole you see right there. So where do we have it? We have it in Charleston, of course, right? There's a little spot there by Hollywood, and then also across the river in Mount Pleasant. We've also got active spots in Ohio and a couple more in the Northeast. Now, knock on wood, we can eliminate one of those pretty soon here. But in terms of the Charleston infestation, we talked about things being moved via humans. The quarantine zone, which is that red circle-ish thing on the left that was drawn where we knew we had Asian longhorn beetle inside this quarantine zone. So the rule was nothing that might have an ALB can go outside of that. No live insects, no host material, none of that. Sadly, people don't always listen. Stuff got moved over to Mount Pleasant, where you see the reddish blob on the right. And now we have an infestation there. And we know that that infestation came from the Hollywood infestation because of some of the genetics and all that. So unfortunately, some material got moved. We'll probably never know what it was or when it happened, but it's been there a few years for sure. Now, when talking about ambrosia beetles, there's lots of different non-native ones. Some of these can be troublesome. These are a couple, I guess, more notorious ones: granule ambrosia beetle and camphor shoe borer. We see those damaging a lot of nursery stock. Anytime a tree gets stressed, you'll see these things, and these will make a little. We call them a noodle or a toothpick. It's like a thin spaghetti-like shape of sawdust that gets pushed out of there. The one we see most commonly down on the coast, though, is this little feller. I shouldn't say feller. This little lady, actually. The females are the ones that do most of the damage. The black twig borer. This has an extremely wide host range. Basically, if it's a woody thing, black twig borer will feed on it. And what it is most commonly known for is creating this branch flagging, where the end of the branch dies, the end like 8, 10, 12 inches, and then it turns brown and sort of breaks off. This is an aesthetic issue. It's almost never a physiological problem for established plants, but it's something that does get noticed a lot. This is right down here off Highway 17, just pretty near Caw. This is at that Clemson farm there on 17. But all these dead magnolia branches, if you go to these dead branches and you kind of follow it up and you look really close, you can see a little tiny pinhole in there. This is where that female chewed her way in, and then she chews straight up the twig toward the end, and she lays eggs along there, and then the beetles are feeding inside there. So if you see branch flagging on oaks, on magnolias, on whatever, it's almost always going to be this little non-native beetle right here. Another ambrosia beetle that's much more devastating is the red bay ambrosia beetle, and this carries laurel wilt, which is, next to emerald ash borer, probably one of the most devastating forest things we've got in North America, definitely in the Southeast. Laurel wilt hits a lot of different Lauraceae. It's a very standard ambrosia beetle life cycle, so to speak. But there you can see in the middle those frass tubes and the little toothpicks, we call them. Every one of those things coming out of that tree is mostly sawdust. It's a little bit of beetle poop, and sometimes there might be some fungus growing in there that kind of holds it all together. But every one of those little needles, those little noodles, is from one female ambrosia beetle. Okay, so they go in there. They have a fungus they carry on them. All ambrosia beetles carry a fungus kind of on their, think of like their shoulders, their elytra, or their head. And as they chew their way in, that gets off on the inside of that woody gallery, and it grows, and it turns darkish, like you see there. Both the adults and the larvae feed on the fungi, not really on the tree. So really, they're just using that tree to drill a home. That's all they're doing. They're drilling a hole to make a house. Everything in the family Lauraceae is susceptible to laurel wilt. Down on the coast, you're looking at red bays, all the red bays. As you get further upstate into the the mountains, you got sassafras is a big component of stuff. And then there's lots of other less common things, camphor tree and bay laurel and pond spice and all these. But anything in the family Lauraceae is susceptible. And we always, I guess I wouldn't say joke, but we cope. You never knew how much red bay was in the coastal forest until it was all brown and dead. And red bay tends to hold its leaves after it dies. So you'll get, picture upon picture. I almost guarantee you, if you drive around, you're going to see dead red bays because they're all going to look like this. This is all from Laurel. Okay. And so this is another super sad story. It was first found just north of Savannah back in '02. And, there wasn't really any management put on it, probably because red bay is not really a commercial species, right? So it's just been kind of moving and filling in gaps. And here's where we are so far. From a region perspective, if you look a little closer, this is what South Carolina looks like. My hunch is it's probably in more counties than we know, but these are the ones that we know for sure at this point. So that is Laurel. Now we'll talk about spotted lanternfly. Nikki and I were chatting about this earlier. Major pests of fruit trees and vines, and this has only been here about 12 years in North America. For the longest time, we talked about this in abstract terms because it was something we didn't have yet. But as of just a couple of years, I guess last year, we have it. This was end of April of this year up in Greenville is where we have these. They start out as these little black bugs with white spots on them. As they get a little older, they'll develop that reddish coloration. And then finally, the adults you see on the right develop these black spotted wings. They're pretty good size. They're about a half inch or so. This is one on the tip of my finger. And here's the current distribution map. So you can see they're creeping down into North Carolina, Tennessee, 2 counties in the upstate have them, and then they're in the suburban Atlanta as well. So a question I got earlier, is it too warm in the low country for them to establish, or are they just not here yet? My hunch is they're just not there yet. They'll probably get there at some point, but they haven't yet, thankfully. The life cycle is from what we know, probably one generation a year, though it's very likely we're going to get 2 generations a year in some of these warmer areas. One of the real tricky things about spotted lanternflies is one, they will put their eggs on basically everything that's not moving at the time. This can be a car tire, this could be a train, this could be a picnic table that gets moved. They don't really care where they put their eggs. The other part, the other side of this is the eggs are really hard to find, and you can see them in that October to June circle there. For those of us, of a certain age, we used to play with silly putty as a kid. It was basically just a lump of clay they gave us to play with. It looks like flattened silly putty, which is really hard to find on things that are already grayish or brownish, right? It just kind of molded in there. So A, they're hard to find. B, they're really, really good hitchhikers. So all this to say, it stands to reason that they're probably going to spread more in the state. They can feed on over 100 different things. They do like tree of heaven. And before anyone gets all excited thinking this will wipe out tree of heaven, which is another invasive species, there's no chance there will ever be that many. There's just too many tree of heaven. And the impacts of spotted lanternfly, agriculture is obviously a big one. They'll damage, any of the tree fruits. It'll basically hit any woody thing that's smooth barked. It doesn't seem to like oaks a whole lot. It doesn't like pine, too much sap and all that. But any of the nut trees, apple trees, peach trees, all those are fair game. There's the nuisance factor. Where these things are common, they're there by the millions, and they will crawl on you. They will crawl over you. They get squished, and the sidewalk gets sticky. They're absolute mess in a lot of places. And then as a spotted lanternfly feeds, it basically sticks its mouth parts into the plant it's on, sucks the juice out of there, and then poops out essentially what is sugar water. That sugar water then goes on whatever is below it. And because it's sweet, you end up attracting all sorts of stuff that likes sweet things like bald-faced hornets and yellow jackets and all these other insects. So in places where you've got a lot of these spotted lanternflies, kind of everything below it gets covered in this gross, sticky, sappish stuff that attracts things that sting. So it's not great all around. Speaking of things that sting, we also have an invasive hornet here in South Carolina. I just love the Far Side. There really is a comic for absolutely everything in the Far Side. So we do have an invasive hornet, the yellow-legged hornet. So native to Southeast Asia, found in Georgia and South Carolina in 23. And I should add, it was found in North Carolina about a month ago. Okay, so it's now up in North Carolina as well. I have no risk to humans on here in that it is not going to actively come at you, but I should just also say it's still a hornet. It can still sting you. So if you act irresponsibly, yes, there's absolutely a risk because it's a hornet, but in general, it is not after people or pets in any way, shape, or form. Here's Georgia. And so essentially, you're looking at Savannah to Hilton Head to Charleston as the main pocket of all the yellow-legged hornet stuff. So here's sort of the Georgia side, and then here's your South Carolina side picking right up. You'll notice we've got a few spots up there just south of Charlotte. That's kind of the Rock Hill, York area. Where they found it in North Carolina is also essentially the greater Charlotte area as well. So um, that was probably moved by people inadvertently. It's highly, highly unlikely that it flew from the coast all the way up there. And we'll talk about that in a second. In terms of life cycle, this is what we have. This is what we know. This thing is super invasive in Europe. So a lot of what we know in North America comes from that European work and European literature. Let's just so over winter the adult queens are hibernating. They're kind of hiding in leaf litter, loose bark, that type of thing. April, the queens come out and they make what we call a primary nest. This is where she starts her brood. Here's one in someone's hand. So you're looking at like baseball to softball size thing. Okay. And she'll typically put this under an awning or, swing set, usually somewhere protected, but it's not too high up in the tree. She'll make some brood. Okay. And then as the workers start coming out in late May, then they will move and make a bigger nest. And a lot of times they will just add on to that primary nest. So there might be a primary nest right inside the middle of that one, but they will make a primary nest. And this is where the colony starts growing a good bit. Okay. And so then we get to now, which is about August, and you've got lots and lots and lots of workers. And now they will completely move and they will make another nest. We call this a secondary nest. And this is typically going to be way up in a tree or something. So I've got one circled here. It looks like, oh, that could be substantial sized. They are large, right? These things are beach ball size where you can't get your arms around them. Okay. Some of these things are just absolutely massive. And the entomologist in me is obviously so excited to see some of these, as you can see on my face. But these things can be over 100 feet up in trees. They're incredibly hard to get at, to get out of there and to eradicate. The reason we are all up in arms about the yellow-legged hornet is it is a real major pest of honeybees, and honeybees are such a big cog in the agriculture wheel. Almost everything we eat is pollinated by something, and honeybees are kind of the cows of the pollination world. So what the yellow-legged hornet does is we call this hawking, to where it will buzz like a hummingbird in front of a honeybee hive. Here you can see one hawking right here. And as those honeybees either come in to the hive or leave the hive, it just simply grabs them. And it will take them up to a tree, bite off the wings, bite off the head, bite off the abdomen, eat the thorax. And then it will just go back and grab another one. And so that's one of the things we're going to try and figure out is how many bees can a hornet eat in a day, right? We know that after a pretty short time, the presence of hornets makes these honeybees change their behavior. They stop going out and pollinating. So it's a real significant agriculture issue. And quite frankly, we don't know the true extent of it yet, but we're working on it. And now, if hornets weren't bad enough, we do have invasive spider in South Carolina as well. The Joro spider. This is again native to Asia, and you're probably seeing the theme. These are all native to Asia. Again, think about how much stuff comes from Asia over here as cargo, right? Probably around 2010s this thing got here. So these things get fairly substantial. They're very similar to the big banana spiders y'all have on the coast. Same genus. Think of them as cousins. Okay. This is one in my hand here. So the overwinter is a little egg sac. There it is. The little spiderlings hatch in late April to early May. And actually, one of the things we heard in a lot of the media is these things would fly. Giant flying spiders was a very common headline for a while there. We know that this does happen, but what happens is right after they hatch, a lot of the little spiderlings will go up somewhere tall and put out a strand of silk from their backside, and the wind will just carry them. And I have this picture because one of my grad students was walking her dog, and this was late April, and this little spiderling just landed on her. It's a little Joro spiderling. So just by luck, one was drifting along and found its way to Beth. They will settle and then they will start getting bigger. About probably early May is when most people with a keen eye will really see these things. So here's a young one here, and then they will get larger throughout the summer into August, September, and then typically by late fall is when they get really big and juicy. And so this is a big female. The females are the ones with the color. And I got to be honest, the botanical garden up in Clemson has got some of the largest Joros I've seen anywhere. So this is the biggest one I think I've seen, covered about half of the bill of my hat there. Again, these are very similar to the banana spiders, which are extremely common in the low country, same genus. I always like to tell people, how do you tell these things apart? Banana spiders look like they're wearing the fuzzy leg warmers. Think Olivia Newton-John in the 80s, Banana spiders have those fuzzy leg warmers on the legs. Joros do not. They just have that black and yellow leg pattern. They also get confused with garden spiders a lot. The big difference here is those garden spiders make that zigzag white thing that goes right down the middle of the web. Joro spiders do not do such a thing. Joros are definitely spreading. So we first found them outside Athens, Georgia, back in 14. They probably got there a few years before that. And, all of the models we've seen show these things having the ability to live basically throughout most of Eastern North America. And we keep track. iNaturalist is pretty good for keeping track of these things. So you can see they're focused in Georgia, South Carolina, North Carolina, and Tennessee. I don't think, to my knowledge, the closest they are to the low country is about the I-20 range. So around Augusta, we've seen a few of them. I'm sure that'll change come fall when we have, the adults get larger and easier to see. So are these things good news? This was one of the main talking points some folks said when we first had these Joros. Well, we should just welcome our new spider overlords because they're going to eat things we don't want around. And I always think of this really depends on your point of view. Is an invasive spider good news? And I like this cartoon especially because it's got these adults that are looking at this little mobile over the baby and they say, oh, it's beautiful. I love it. But all the baby sees is butts twirling overhead, right? So point of view really matters. As an ecologist and a scientist that deals with invasive species, I don't think this is good news. And we've done a good bit of work that shows where the Joro spiders are, they're pushing all the natives out, right? So if you've got a lot of Joro spiders, they're just simply, it's almost impossible to find a native orb weaver at that point, okay? Whether that's just raw numbers, whether you compare these things side by side, every one of these squares is the comparison between a native spider and a Joro, and every one that's circled in red means where Joros are, the natives get suppressed, okay? We know that Joro spiders eat absolutely everything. Spiders are indiscriminate predators. So yes, they will eat an invasive stink bug. They are just as likely to eat a rare pollinating butterfly. Okay, they simply don't care because it's a spider. And if it moves in the web, they're going to go down and eat it. So one of the big things we try to do with folks is at least, just get them to report. We want to know where these things are and where they're going. So we work with Georgia a lot. We do our Joro watch every year. I hope you all will take part and let us know if you see any of these things. Now, I get a lot of questions on Joros, so I have my short Q&A here. Are they venomous? Is one of the first things I get asked. That's your question. All spiders are venomous. The difference is the venom of a Joro spider is nothing more than mildly irritating. It's kind of like a mosquito bite. That's about all it is, okay? Will they get in the house? Orb weavers in general make these great big webs. Remember Charlotte from Charlotte's Web? She was an orb weaver and she had to have a place to spread out her big web. So they're not coming in your house unless you bring them inside. Okay. Will they bite me or my pets? They will if you really provoke them. And by really provoke them, we actually did a study where we had a bunch of undergraduate volunteers. We paid $10 to try to get bit by a Joro. And the only way they could get bit is if we physically grabbed the Joro spider and mashed it on their hand enough. Then eventually it would bite. But in 0 cases, just running into a Joro spider outside, it didn't do anything other than try to get to the ground and get off you, right? So we talked about all the inverts. Now let's talk about vertebrates because we have those as well, sadly. So probably the most, I guess, notorious one, well, maybe second most notorious is the tegu lizard. Okay, so we get these in South Carolina. These are pretty good sized things. They can be up to 4 feet long, 10 pounds or so. They've got a lot of the great invasive species characteristics, right? They're predatory and omnivorous, which means it'll eat it whether it's moving or not moving, can survive everywhere. They're aggressive, they're intelligent. We know they're established in Florida, established in Georgia, and at this point, we've only documented them throughout South Carolina. We don't know that there's any confirmed sustained populations or reproduction yet, right? So we just don't know that yet. How do you guys think the tegu lizard got here? Well, if you're thinking pets, you're absolutely right, right? If you just go online, you're going to see, people snuggling with these things. You're going to see one that's clearly overweight, chilling on the couch. I mean, here's one in a sweater. So look, these are pets that come in, and when people get sick of the pet, they think it's a lizard, it'll be fine. They just let it go outside, right? You can buy these things in all sorts of, like it took me literally 2 seconds of Googling to find out where I could buy a tegu lizard. What do you do now? The DNR is working super hard. They know that current pets, they've passed regulations. Current pets have to be registered and chipped. No more new ones. We've got a complete ban on those. And then, of course, whenever one is reported, it gets eradicated ASAP. Okay, so that's what we're trying to do to keep them out. Am I optimistic that it's going to work? I wish I were more optimistic, but I'm simply not. Probably our invasive pest number one is our wild hogs, right? So this is the most common non-native vert we have around. Native to Eurasia, they were brought for food way back when, and then of course they both escaped domestication and were also intentionally released for hunting. So there's not really a great map, but here's one from 1982 that shows you the purple counties where we knew there were invasive hogs. Okay, so take a look at your southeast here. And now this is one from 24, and it's basically everywhere in the Southeast has wild hogs at this point, right? And if you look in South Carolina, we need to update this map, but they love the lowlands and they love, watery areas. They love bottomlands. That is where you're typically going to find, I should say, that's where you're going to have the most chance of finding a wild hog. It's kind of one of those bottomland type areas along rivers and such. Found throughout the state. If you are a hunter, there's no season or limit. Take all you want. Go for it, right? The impacts of wild hogs are just, if you've not seen wild hog damage, it is just mind-blowing what they do in terms of their rooting around for things underground, whether it's tubers underground or insects or other things underground to eat. Here's damage they did in the cornfield. They basically went in after it was planted and just ate all the corn kernels. And then, they'll damage stuff on their way to golf courses and then even sea turtles. They've got some cages now they try to put over those sea turtle nests. But if you've got wild hogs in a beach area and there's turtles there, they're going to try and eat every one of those eggs. They just really, really go for those. Clemson's invasive species program, I work very closely with them. If you go to that website, and I can give you all these slides if you'd like, but we've got pages for some of these things we talked about and a bunch of others. And with that, I am finished talking. So I'm happy to take questions. I see there's some things in the chat. So Nikki, I'm going to stop sharing. You're muted, Nikki.
There we go. Thank you. I'm happy to read those out. And then if anybody else has questions, you can certainly jump in. Thank you so much, Dave, for this presentation. One question was that they're not sure if they missed it. Did you say where the EABs have come from, like how they got here?
China. They're from China. We know that. They likely got here in solid wood packing material. They were first found in Detroit, and that's another great big port area, right? So EAB was a tricky one. When we first found EAB and figured out what it was, scientists at our Smithsonian initially called over their Chinese counterparts and they said, hey, we've got this beetle. What do we do about it? And the Chinese folks said, well, nothing. It's not a pest over here. We find it in trees that are dead and dying, and that's it. So you had a part of the reason EAB went everywhere is because we had no knowledge of how to manage it because it did not need to be managed where it was native. And so they just said, we don't know what to do. We never had to do anything about it, right? And so it takes a lot of time to figure out, well, gosh, what do you even do, right? Figure out what will it eat, how fast it travel, what life stage are susceptible. Just takes such a long time. And by that point, cat's out of the bag and the populations were just growing too fast.
Thank you. Another
Mhm.
question is, I am just outside the ALB quarantine zone, but I'm seeing maple trees damaged in my neighborhood in West Ashley. Not completely sure it's ALB. Can I request Clemson to come and confirm or deny?
You sure can go to that website, and you should be able to put a you know, I think I have ALB in there, and we'll send one of the regulatory folks to come take a peek.
Great. Thank you.
Yep. West Ashley's not far, so yes, please report
Okay.
that. Do
Um,
that right now, actually. Hop off this and report that.
don't get off before you do that.
Yeah, don't leave it. Don't leave it.
Okay. Is Tegu banned in the US or just in South Carolina?
I think it's banned in the US. I'd have to double check that.
Okay.
But I mean, I think people recognize in Florida and Georgia real quick, like this is a problem. And gosh, by that point, so many people had them. And I mean, you see people make sweaters for them, for God's sake. So like, it's just it's hard. It's ridiculous. But
Yeah. Okay. And then someone
Mhm.
asked about armadillos.
They're native. What do you do? Sweet gum. I get that too. Is sweet gum invasive? It is not invasive. It's native here. Is it aggressive and really good at colonizing places? Sure is. Are armadillos really adept at going everywhere? Yeah, they are, but good for them. Um, we are seeing, and this armadillos are a great case study because we're seeing them move north into places they hadn't been before. Does that make them invasive, or are they just naturally moving?
Migrating.
Right? I would argue they're just naturally moving. They're from here. So pestiferous, sure. Got one in my yard that I've been battling with for a couple of weeks now, but you know.
Okay. Thank you.
Mhm.
And then someone asked about, which I think you went into a little bit about the yellow-legged hornet and like the problems that we're having with it. So I think that was partly the bees.
Yeah, that's all agriculture. All agriculture. Yep.
Okay. Oh, and then someone
Mhm.
said, when did armadillos become native? But they've always been down south, right?
Yep, yep, and in Mexico and all that. So yeah, they're not an invasive species. They're one that's moving, but not an invasive. And that's why I kind of went over some of those definitions on the front end, right? So from a scientific perspective, we've got kind of strict definitions on what is invasive and not. And those definitions really stem from federal guidelines and who pays for what is kind of where all of this, like, why do you have so many definitions? Well, it all gets down to who's going to pay for it. And getting to the federal level, that often determines what checkbook things come from, is whether it is a truly invasive thing not from North America or a thing from North America that has simply moved a lot. And southern pine beetle, which we didn't talk about because it's a native species, but as it moved up into the northeastern US, there were lots of discussions with some of those folks. Well, is this invasive since it's not been seen in New York ever? It's not, though. It's from so, and that determined who was going to do the management on it all. So that's kind of how it all gets back to why we care what it is.
Anybody else have questions? You can just unmute and jump in or put it in the chat, whatever's easiest.
Hey, Nikki, this is Scott. Dave, hey, great presentation, super informative. I
Yeah,
gotta, I gotta tell you, man, a little depressing. This,
welcome to my
this
world.
seems, very dire. Several times it's like, well, are they coming here or they're just not here yet? And it seems like so many of these species eventually they're just going to continue to expand and broaden. So,
Yeah,
looking like long term, long range, do y'all see like any opportunity in the future where species may adapt to a point where they start, perhaps foraging on these natives and keeping them in check to kind of regain some sort of balance similar to where they came from? Or is this just kind of a lost cause? and, just do what we can to, nibble around the corners with, with like management and transportation and shipping and commerce and things like that. So
Yeah.
is there anything like kind of bigger out there that you're seeing may help things mitigate, in the future? Over.
My large size should probably tell you where I'm going with this, but I think there are things that eat these invasives, but all the things that eat the invasives are just generalists, and they're eating all the other stuff too, right? This is and when we had Asian, I'll give you an example. We had Asian longhorn beetle down there. We thought, well, maybe we've got, they've got this little native wasp that they can rear that feeds on it exclusively. It loves it. We've let a bunch go of these native wasps, thinking, will they just cue in on the Asian longhorn beetles? But there's so many other longhorn beetles and larvae like that in all the trees down there. Why do they care if it's ALB? They'll just go to whichever one's closest, right? So it just doesn't work at all. So will birds eat them? Sure. Bats, sure. But like, will any of these species basically chill out and have an equilibrium? Haven't seen it yet. One would like to think maybe. I think for some of the ambrosial beetles, you can make the argument that some of the non-native species didn't really become invasive per se, but also the way our system works is impacts that matter are economic and human health. And so there's a lot we don't know about ecological impacts of a lot of these non-native species, right? And I think back to those ambrosial beetles I showed in that figure. I mean, when I was checking those traps, it was all ambrosial beetles and then like 4 natives, right? But we don't have any information on what do they do. Presumably something when you've got a diverse biological system where all of a sudden one thing comes in and pushes all this other stuff out. It looks like it functions normally, but we don't really know like the details of it. So it's going to be species by species. Things that are really aggressive, like the emerald ash borer, like laurel wilt, that's only going to chill out when all their hosts are dead. And we've seen that with laurel wilt on the coast because it's so hard to find a red bay now. We've seen that with EAB in the Midwest, where ash, is 30% of the canopy. It's all dead now. Yeah, it's hard to find an EAB because they got nothing to eat at this point. And so I think that's probably what we're going to see is, and when you get these big waves of invasives come in, you get this huge wave and it wipes out all the hosts, and then the wave crashes, but then it just sort of does this like little simmer. And I think it'll just simmer in perpetuity to where as soon as an ash tree gets big enough to be a host, it's going to get hit, die again. And so it'll just simmer forever at that point. Has that naturalized, or is that just, that's another semantic thing?
I know like on the invasive aquatic side with the giant salvinia that's becoming a problem in the lake systems, there's been some success developing, and this is kind of backwards, right? The giant salvinia, I think it's a weevil that's been developed that's been somewhat successful. So,
right.
I don't know if there's like an opposite paradigm here,
The examples of successful biocontrol are a fraction of invasives. There are a few. The air potato vine down in Florida, which is all over, they've got a weevil that really hammers that thing down. It's really hard, and it takes a lot of work and a lot of effort to get a good biocontrol agent, though. And part of the challenge, I think, maybe more broadly, is the way our system works, the funding system, the support to do this work. It's reaction based, right? It's really, really hard to get support to work on something that's not here yet. I can tell you that from experience, right? That's the big challenge. And we know, the whole ounce of prevention, blah, blah, blah. It's just hard to get support to do preventative stuff, which doesn't make any sense. But then when you look at, well, if they've got all this money to hand out, it's going to New World screwworm, and it's going to bird flu, and it's going to things that we're already dealing with. And it's just really tough to parse off chunks of that pie to do something proactive. And I think that's probably the biggest challenge we have in this field in general. So
Thanks, Dave. All
yeah.
right. I'm just gonna say thank you very much. We will definitely be in touch to try to organize something in person. I think that there's a lot of people who would really be interested in that. Everyone's saying thank you and how informative this was. So I'll leave it at that. It is 8 o'clock. I just think thank you all for joining us, and I'll be sending out more emails to let you know what's coming up. And Dave, I'll be in touch. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, everybody.
So, good night. Good
Okay,
night.
have a good one. See ya.